The story begins in a place that most of the world had forgotten. It was a small town surrounded by dry fields and broken roads where the air carried both dust and silence. The people there lived with little, but what they lacked in wealth they made up for in spirit. Families were close, neighbors cared for one another, and even in hardship there was laughter, often carried by the children who played in narrow lanes and dirt fields. But beneath those moments of ordinary life was a deep struggle. Food had grown scarce. Medicines were almost impossible to find. Many families survived on half a loaf of bread a day, or a single bowl of soup shared between 3 or 4. Parents gave up their own portions so their children could eat. Grandparents told stories late into the night, not because they had energy to spare, but because words and hope were sometimes all they could offer. The town's leaders, ordinary men and women trusted by the people, understood that they could not survive this way forever. Too many families were falling sick, too many lives were on the edge, and so they did what seemed to be their only choice. They asked for help. They wrote letters, dozens of them, sent to different countries, organizations, anyone who might listen. They spoke of their suffering, of the hunger and the illness, of how all they asked for was mercy, not weapons, not soldiers, but food, clean water, and a chance to live without fear. The children, too young to understand politics, learned to hope in their own way. Some of them drew pictures on scraps of paper, pictures of wheat fields, fruit trees, and houses filled with light, and gave them to the elders, asking if these could be sent along with the letters. Perhaps they thought if others saw the dreams of children, they would understand more clearly. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months, and as the waiting stretched on, the people's hope began to feel fragile, like glass that might shatter with one wrong step. Still they waited. Every sound of an engine on the horizon, every strange shadow in the sky, every rumor carried from the next town over sparked whispers. Maybe they are coming. Maybe someone heard us. The elders of the town often gathered in the evening near the old stone well at the center of the village. It was cracked and nearly dry, but it was the one place where everyone felt connected. They would sit there, speaking quietly about the letters they had sent. Some believed mercy would come. Others, older and wearier, feared that the world had grown deaf to voices like theirs. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with red and gold, a young boy asked his grandfather, "When will they bring us bread?" The old man had no answer. He touched the boy's hair gently and looked toward the horizon. Inside, his heart carried both faith and doubt. Faith that people somewhere in the world could be kind, and doubt that kindness could ever reach this forgotten place. As time went on, hunger made itself heavier. Some families tried to plant small gardens in patches of soil, but the ground was dry and water was too precious to waste on anything but drinking. Still they tried. Others worked with what little they had, trading clothes, small tools, even wedding rings for a bag of flour or a bit of medicine that travelers sometimes carried. Despite all this, the spirit of mercy never left the community. They cared for each other in ways that cost them dearly. A mother who had saved enough bread for her child gave half to a neighbor's daughter who had gone 3 days without food. An elderly man who found medicine for his lungs gave it instead to a younger neighbor who needed it more. They did not have much, but they gave what they could. Mercy lived among them, even as they waited for mercy from the outside world. Then came a night when the sky filled with noise. Far away beyond the mountains there was a low thunder that grew louder and closer. The people gathered outside their homes, pointing at the horizon. Some thought it might be rain, for they had not seen rain in many weeks. Others thought perhaps finally the world had answered them. Maybe trucks with supplies were coming, bringing sacks of grain, clean water, and doctors to heal the sick. Children clapped their hands and danced at the sound, certain that their waiting was finally over. The elders looked at each other with cautious eyes, not ready to believe, but not willing to take away the children's joy. That night, no one slept. Families stayed awake, waiting. Mothers held their children close, whispering stories about the mornings to come. Breakfast with fresh bread, strong tea, sweet fruit. Fathers imagined building back the broken roads and schools once their people had the strength again. The entire town breathed the same dream, that tomorrow, mercy would arrive, but the truth was still hidden beyond the horizon, carried inside the roaring engines that moved closer with every passing hour. And while the people slept in hope or sat awake in prayer, The world beyond their borders had made a decision. Their letters had indeed been read. Their pleas had indeed been heard. But mercy was not the answer that had been chosen. What they had asked for was compassion. What they would soon receive was something entirely different. The morning after that long night of waiting, the town woke with a nervous excitement. From far away, the sound of heavy engines rolled across the fields. Dust rose on the horizon like a storm. People stepped out of their homes, shading their eyes against the sun. Children pointed, whispering to one another. Mothers held their little ones tighter. The old men gathered near the stone well, listening, as if the earth itself was carrying a message through its trembling ground. For weeks, they had dreamed of trucks filled with sacks of rice, flour, clean bottles of water, maybe doctors with gentle hands and medicines that could heal. They had asked for mercy, and surely now help was arriving. The first vehicles came into view by midday. They were large, painted in colors that looked sharp and unwelcoming. Their wheels churned the dry soil into clouds of dust. At first, people cheered. Some even waved. Children ran a few steps forward before their mothers pulled them back. "Wait," the mothers whispered, "let them come closer." But as the line of vehicles grew clearer, the smiles began to fade. These were not supply trucks. They were armored. Their bodies were heavy with metal. And behind the dark glass windows, no doctors, no nurses, no smiling workers were seen. Only soldiers. The people fell quiet. The cheering stopped. Even the children sensed something had gone wrong. The elders exchanged troubled glances. This was not what they had asked for. This was not mercy. The convoy entered the heart of the town. Soldiers stepped down, boots hitting the earth in a rhythm that sounded more like thunder than footsteps. Their faces were hard, their movements exact, as though they had rehearsed this arrival many times. Weapons hung at their sides, not fired, not raised, but present enough to remind everyone that power had arrived, not kindness. The leaders of the town stepped forward. Their hands were open, showing no threat. Their eyes searched the soldiers' faces for signs of compassion. One of the elders spoke, his voice shaking yet steady enough to carry across the square. He welcomed them, thanking them for coming. He explained again what the people had asked for: food, medicine, water, safety. His words were simple, his tone respectful, but the soldiers did not answer with words of comfort. Instead, their commander gave quick orders, and the men began setting up checkpoints. A barricade was built at the town's entrance. Maps were unrolled. Instructions were barked out in a language most villagers barely understood. The people watched in silence. Their hearts, which had been filled with hope only hours earlier, now grew heavy with confusion. Was this protection or control? Children clung to their mothers' clothes. Fathers stood quietly, trying to hide their unease. The elders returned to the well that night, sitting in a circle under the fading stars. "We asked for bread," one whispered, "but they have brought us chains." Still, the people tried to remain patient. Perhaps they thought this was only the beginning. Maybe the soldiers had come first and the food and doctors would follow. They gave themselves reasons to believe, because hope was easier to carry than despair. Days passed. The soldiers stayed. Checkpoints grew stricter. Families were told where they could and could not go. Travel to the next town was stopped. Even to visit relatives beyond the hills required permission slips stamped by unfamiliar hands. The marketplace, once noisy with barter and chatter, grew quiet. Traders stopped coming, fearful of the soldiers on the roads. The little supplies the town had managed to gather were quickly shrinking. Mothers stretched their meals thinner and thinner. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why can't we go outside after dark? Why do they stand at every corner? Why did they not bring food? The soldiers, to many of the villagers, felt distant. They rarely smiled. They rarely spoke except in commands. Their presence was heavy, like a shadow that followed every step. Yet among them, a few looked different. Some soldiers, younger and quieter, let their eyes soften when they saw the children. They too seemed uncertain why they were there. But orders were orders, and orders were followed. The town's spirit, however, had not yet broken. Families still gathered in the evenings, whispering stories of better days. The old songs were sung softly, so as not to draw unwanted attention. In the darkness of their homes, neighbors shared what little they had left. Half a loaf split 3 ways, a few drops of tea poured into many cups. They kept mercy alive among themselves, even when mercy had not come from outside. But with each passing week, the weight of the soldiers grew heavier. Rules became stricter. Meetings at the well were discouraged. Groups were told not to gather without permission. The once lively lanes of the town felt quieter, emptier, as though the air itself had been silenced. One afternoon, a group of children were playing near the edge of the square, kicking a ball made of rags. Their laughter rang out, the last sound of innocence left in the place. A soldier nearby barked at them to stop, pointing to a sign they could not read. The children froze, the ball falling still. Their mothers rushed forward, pulling them close. The soldier did not hurt them, but the fear his voice left behind stayed long after. From that day, the children played less. Their games moved indoors, hidden from the eyes of those who had come in the name of protection. The people felt the distance between what they had asked for and what they had received growing wider each day. They had asked for mercy, and instead they lived under command. They had asked for bread, and instead they tasted fear. Yet even in those days, a quiet strength grew among them. They told themselves, this is not forever. We must endure. We must hold each other strong until real mercy comes. Every night families prayed, not just for food, not just for water, but for understanding. They prayed that those who came with soldiers' boots might one day see with human eyes, and that hearts hardened by duty might soften again. For now, though, the town lived under the watch of men they had never called for. The sound of armored trucks replaced the sound of song. The glow of lanterns indoors replaced the joy of gathering under the stars, and the people carried within them both hope and heartbreak, waiting for the day when mercy would finally arrive in the form they had dreamed. But that day was not yet here, because the soldiers had only just begun their stay, and soon, the weight of their presence would test the patience, the kindness, and the spirit of the people more deeply than they could imagine. The days under the soldiers stretched into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Life in the town no longer felt like life. It felt like waiting. Waiting for permission to go out. Waiting for a line at a checkpoint. Waiting for something that might finally change. Everywhere, rules hung heavy in the air. The people were told when they could leave their homes, when they could gather, when they could light their lanterns at night. The freedom they had once taken for granted, even in their hardships, was slowly slipping away. At first, the people tried to adapt. They obeyed the curfews, they lined up quietly at the checkpoints, they lowered their voices in the market. But no matter how careful they were, the feeling of being watched never left them. Soldiers stood, at every corner, their faces unreadable, their boots pressing down on the same streets where children once ran freely. And yet, despite all this, the heart of the people refused to break. Inside homes lit by single candles, neighbors still gathered. They whispered old stories, sang old songs, and reminded one another of the days before. Bread was shared quietly across fences. A handful of dates, a scoop of rice, a cup of water. These small acts of kindness kept them alive, not just in body but in spirit. But the clash was growing slowly, quietly, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. One evening, at the old stone, where elders still met in secret, the talk was not about food or sickness. It was about dignity. We asked for mercy, one said, and they gave us rules. Another shook his head. We cannot live forever in silence. Our voices will fade if we do not use them. The younger men and women listened carefully. They had grown tired of waiting for the world to notice their suffering. They had grown tired of lowering their eyes whenever soldiers passed. What they wanted was not a fight, not a war. They wanted only to be heard, to live again with the small freedoms they had once known. And so, little by little, acts of quiet resistance began. A group of women carried baskets of bread through the streets, refusing to hide their generosity. They gave to families who had none, even though the rules forbade gatherings. Children began, humming songs of hope under their breath as they walked past checkpoints. They were not loud, but the tune spread quickly, carried from one home to another until the whole town knew it. The soldiers did not understand the words, but they felt the meaning. One night, a few men slipped through the fields to fetch water from a stream beyond the hills. The rules said they needed permission, but permission never came. They returned with buckets and gave them to families whose wells had run dry. To them, this was not breaking the rules. This was survival. The clash was not of weapons, it was of humanity. The people wanted to live with dignity, while the soldiers had been ordered to maintain control. The soldiers themselves were not all the same. Some carried out every order with hard eyes and firm voices. Others seemed troubled. A young soldier once paused at a checkpoint when he saw an old woman carrying a bundle too heavy for her thin arms. For a moment he looked as though he wanted to help her, but then, with a sharp call from his superior, he turned away, his face closing once more. The people noticed these small cracks. They began to wonder, were the soldiers truly their enemies, or were they also trapped by orders they could not escape? Still, mistrust grew. Fear built walls between the two sides. A simple word spoken too loudly could be misunderstood. A glance held too long could invite suspicion. One afternoon in the marketplace, the tension showed itself clearly. A trader argued with a soldier about why his goods were being searched so harshly. His voice was raised not in anger but in desperation. He explained that the food was for children, not for profit. But the soldier, unable to bend the rules, ordered him to step back. The trader's face burned with shame as neighbors watched. No fight happened that day, but the wound was deeper than any physical scar. The people talked about it for weeks. "We are treated as if we are dangerous," one mother whispered, "yet all we carry is bread and water." The soldiers, too, were growing restless. Many of them had been away from their own homes for months. They missed their families. They wondered why they were stationed here, in a town that had asked only for help. Orders told them one story. The people's eyes told them another, and so the clash of humanity continued, not in explosions or battles, but in silence, in stares, in the unspoken weight between two groups who lived side by side, yet did not trust one another. The town, however, did not give up its spirit. If anything, the more rules were placed on them, the more quietly they found ways to resist. Children began sneaking drawings into the soldiers' hands, pictures of homes, gardens, bread, and smiling faces. Some soldiers looked confused, others looked moved, but none of them could forget those pictures. The women of the town started baking bread in larger batches, not just for their families, but for the neighbors who had nothing. "If we share," one woman said, "they cannot take our humanity from us." Even the elders who had once spoken cautiously now spoke with more strength. "We will not be silenced by fear," one elder declared at the well. "Our voices are not weapons, they are the truth." The people were not looking for conflict. They were looking for recognition. They wanted the soldiers to see them not as rules to be enforced, but as human beings with beating hearts and hungry children. But each act of resistance, no matter how gentle, made the soldiers uneasy. They saw gatherings where none were allowed. They heard songs that were not on their lists. They felt the quiet defiance that spread through the streets like fire under the ashes. The commander grew stricter. Curfews were enforced more tightly. Checkpoints were doubled. Markets were monitored more closely. The people bent but did not break, and the soldiers followed their orders even as doubt grew inside them. One evening, a soldier stood alone at the edge of the square, watching as a group of children played in the dust. They had no ball this time, only a tin can they kicked gently back and forth. Their laughter, soft and hesitant, reached his ears. For a moment he lowered his weapon, closed his eyes, and remembered his own younger siblings far away. He let out a breath he did not realize he was holding. Then, hearing his commander's call, he straightened again, his expression returning to stone. The clash of humanity was no longer about soldiers and villagers. It was about people on both sides, caught between orders and conscience, survival and dignity. The town still dreamed of mercy. They still hoped that one day the soldiers might understand what they had truly asked for. But until then, they carried their strength quietly, in bread shared, in songs whispered, in hope passed from child to child. And as the days passed, both the people and the soldiers felt the tension rise like the heavy air before a storm. Something was coming. Something that would force both sides to face the truth of what it meant to live together in distrust. But for now, they waited, caught in a clash that had no easy answer. The air in the town had grown heavy, like the stillness before a storm. Everyone felt it, though no one wanted to say it aloud. The soldiers had been there for many weeks now, and life had turned into a long routine of waiting, watching, and obeying. The people still carried hope in their hearts, but that hope was stretched thin. Rules weighed on every family. Mothers counted the hours of daylight, reminding their children to return home before curfew. Fathers measured each step in the market, careful not to linger too long or speak too loudly. The old well, once the center of laughter and gatherings, was now a place where people only passed quickly, glancing over their shoulders to see if soldiers were watching. The soldiers themselves seemed restless. They had grown used to the town, its narrow lanes and dusty fields, but they still moved with the stiffness of men who knew they were not welcome. Some carried their duties with cold eyes, while others looked away when they saw the struggles of the people. It was as if even they were trapped, caught between the orders they were told to follow and the human faces they saw each day. Then came the day when patience broke. It began quietly, like so many things do. A line had formed at the checkpoint where people were allowed to bring goods into the market. The sun was hot and the crowd was tired. In the middle of the line stood a father carrying a small sack of flour. He had managed to trade from a traveler. It was meant for his children, who had not eaten bread in days. When the soldier at the checkpoint asked him to open the sack, he obeyed. The soldier dug through the flour, searching for something that wasn't there. When he finished, half the flour spilled onto the ground. The father's face tightened in pain, not from anger, but from the thought of his children waiting at home. He bent down, trying to gather what little he could from the dirt, but a second soldier barked at him to move along. The father hesitated just for a moment, and in that hesitation the silence broke. A murmur rose from the crowd. People whispered, some stepping forward, others pulling back. The soldiers stiffened, their hands tense. The father, holding the torn sack, looked up and spoke, not with shouting, not with threats, but with a trembling voice full of desperation. "All we asked for was bread," he said. "Is this mercy?" The words hung in the air like smoke. The crowd grew still. Even the soldiers did not respond immediately. For the first time, the truth was spoken aloud, not in whispers at night, not in secret meetings by the well, but in the open, in front of both the people and the soldiers. The commander gave a sharp order, breaking the moment. The father was pushed aside and the line moved forward again. But the words had already spread. By the evening, the whole town knew what had happened. That night, families sat in their homes with heavy hearts. Children asked why their father's flour had been taken. Mothers tried to explain, their voices cracking. The elders gathered by the well and spoke with urgency. "We have remained silent too long," one said. "If we do not speak now, we will lose not only our food but our dignity." The next morning, more people than usual went to the market. Not to buy, not to sell, but to stand together. They did not shout. They did not fight. They simply stood, their presence itself a statement. "We are still here. We will not disappear," the soldiers noticed. They tightened their patrols, their eyes scanning the crowd. The commander gave orders to disperse the people, but the crowd did not move. They remained calm but firm. It was not an uprising. It was not a riot. It was a gathering of human beings who wanted to be seen. The tension was unbearable. One could feel the fear pressing down on the square like the heat of the sun. Mothers held their children close. The younger men stood shoulder to shoulder, their hands empty, their eyes steady. The elders stepped forward, speaking in low voices, reminding everyone not to provoke, not to lose control. The soldiers, too, seemed caught. They shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying uncertainty. Some looked down, unable to meet the eyes of the people. Others held their positions rigidly, clinging to the orders that defined their role. The breaking point had arrived, not in violence, but in silence. Two groups stood face to face, neither moving, neither speaking, only breathing the same heavy air. It was then that something unexpected happened. A child stepped forward, slipping away from his mother's hand. He walked toward the soldiers, holding a small piece of bread in his palm. The crowd gasped. The mother cried out softly, but the boy kept walking. He reached the first soldier, lifted his hand, and offered the bread. The soldier froze. He looked at the bread, then at the child. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Behind him, the commander shouted an order. Still, the soldier did not move. The boy placed the bread on the soldier's gloved hand, then turned and walked back to his mother. The square was silent, the world itself holding its breath. In that moment, everyone understood. This was not a fight about food or rules. or checkpoints. It was about being human. The commander quickly ordered the crowd to disperse, and slowly people began to leave. But something had changed. The people had spoken, not with weapons, not with shouts, but with their presence, their silence, and the courage of a child offering bread. That night, the town was alive with quiet conversations. Neighbors spoke of dignity, of courage, of the power of standing together. The soldiers, too, were restless. Some whispered among themselves, questioning the orders they carried. Others remained silent, their thoughts hidden. The breaking point had been reached. There was no going back to silence. The people knew their strength now, and the soldiers had seen their humanity. What would come next, no one could say. But both sides knew that the fragile balance was beginning to crack. And the world that had ignored the town's pleas for mercy would soon be forced to face the truth. Mercy delayed always turns into something harder, something heavier, something that cannot be silenced forever. For the people, the question remained, would the world finally hear them? Or would the soldiers, bound by orders, choose force over compassion? The answer was yet to come. But for the first time in many months, the people felt something stronger than fear. They felt the stirring of hope mixed with defiance, and that combination, once awakened, could not easily be contained. The town was never the same after that day in the square. Something had shifted, something deep and unshakable. For months, the people had lived in silence, obeying rules that pressed down on their spirit. But now, after the child had stepped forward with nothing but a piece of bread, the silence had broken. The soldiers had seen it. The people had seen it. And the world, though far away, could no longer pretend not to hear. Life under the soldiers continued, but it carried a different air. The people no longer bowed their heads quite as low. Their steps, though still careful, carried more weight. When mothers went to the market, they spoke to one another with a little more courage. When fathers carried water from the well, they did so with straighter backs. Even the children who had once hidden their laughter indoors began to play again in the lanes, though still under the watchful eyes of soldiers. It was not freedom, but it was not silence either. The soldiers, too, were changing. Some still carried out their duties with coldness, but others could no longer hide the doubt on their faces. They had seen the bread in the child's hand, and it had stayed with them. A few softened when they checked baskets at the market. Others looked away when people whispered songs at night. They were still bound by orders, but their hearts were no longer untouched. The elders gathered more often at the old well, their voices firm. "We have been tested," one said. "We did not fight with weapons. We did not shout with anger. We stood with dignity, and that is stronger than any force." Stories of the bread began to spread beyond the town. Travelers carried the tale with them to distant places. Letters were written again, not only asking for help this time, but telling the truth of what had happened, how mercy had been asked for, how soldiers had come instead, and how the people had found strength in their silence and unity. Weeks later, something unexpected began to happen. Supplies finally arrived, not in abundance and not from the soldiers who had come first, but from outside organizations who had heard the stories. Trucks carried sacks of flour, clean water, and medicines. They did not erase all the suffering, but they reminded the people that their voices had reached farther than they imagined. The townspeople welcomed the aid with gratitude, but also with caution. They had learned that help could carry many faces, some kind, some hard. They took the food and the medicine, but they did not forget the months of waiting, nor the soldiers' presence that still stood at their gates. The soldiers, seeing the arrival of real aid, seemed quieter than before. Some of them helped unload the supplies, their faces unreadable. Others stood aside, unsure of where they fit in this new moment. The people noticed. They whispered among themselves. Perhaps even the soldiers did not want to be the answer we were given. Perhaps they too are trapped. And so the days moved forward, different, but not healed. The children grew quickly in those months. Their eyes, once filled only with innocence, now carried the weight of memory. They would never forget the checkpoints, the curfews, the fear, but they would also never forget the night when their town stood together, or the moment when a small hand offered bread in defiance of silence. The elders, too, began to tell the story more openly. "We asked for mercy," they said, "and the world sent us soldiers. But we found our own mercy among ourselves. We gave it in our bread, in our water, in our songs, in our courage to stand without hate." As time passed, some soldiers left. Others stayed, replaced by new faces. But the people had changed forever. They no longer waited quietly for others to define their lives. They learned that their dignity was their greatest shield, and their unity their strongest weapon. Years later, the town still carried scars. Some houses remained broken, some fields dry, but the memory of those months lived on as a lesson passed down through generations. Mothers told their children, "Never lose hope, even when the world seems deaf." Fathers told their sons and daughters, "Strength is not only in fighting, it is in standing, in refusing to be silenced." The story of the bread became legend, not just for that town, but for other places too. Travelers spoke of it in distant lands. Teachers told it in schools. And in every telling, the message was the same. Mercy denied cannot silence the human spirit. Even some of the soldiers who had once stood in that square carried the memory with them. Years later, when they returned to their own homes, they spoke of the people they had watched, the child with the bread, the dignity they had witnessed. Some of them admitted that it had changed them, reminding them that orders are not always the same as truth. The people, however, carried no bitterness in their telling. They did not speak of revenge or hatred. They spoke of endurance, of how they kept their humanity alive when it could have been lost. And so the story closes not with victory or defeat, but with remembrance. The world had been given a choice. A town asked for mercy. Instead, soldiers came. But what the world could not take away was the humanity of those who endured. The old well still stands at the center of the town. Cracked, weathered, nearly dry, but still there. People gather by it as they always have. They tell the story to children who were not yet born when it happened. They speak of hunger, of silence, of soldiers, but most of all they speak of dignity. And whenever the story is told, it ends the same way. With a whisper that echoes like a warning, like a lesson, like a truth that cannot be ignored. They asked for mercy, but Earth sent its soldiers, and yet we found mercy among ourselves.